Yes, no, we can hear you.
You can hear me now. Always running into microphone troubles. But my name's Noah Michelson. I work in the External Relations Office with Roundup. And so thank you for joining us today. Today we're joined by Matt Strausser, who's the JSC Wildlife biologist. And so he's going to go over some really cool stuff about whether the deer miss us, coyotes that you may have not even known were on site, and just a whole range of topics. So we'd ask that you please mute your microphones just so that everyone's able to hear Matt as he goes through the presentation. We also just wanted to highlight that we're doing this from external relations because we understand that it's been anything but a typical year, and we're just trying to add a little bit of flair to the end of the year, make it a little more enjoyable and connect everyone back to that workplace that we know you're missing right now. So we're going to start with the presentation by Matt. If you have questions during the presentation, go ahead and drop them into the chat. And at the end, once Matt's done, probably 20-30 minutes from now, we'll do from whatever time Matt wraps up until the end of the hour, we will go ahead and do questions from the chat that will be moderated. So if you have any questions, just pop them in there. And just note that this is being recorded. So if you have friends on leave or in other meetings or couldn't join for whatever reason, just please let them know. Great. So Matt, are you ready?
Yeah, thanks so much, Noah. I really appreciate y'all setting this up and giving us an opportunity to speak to the larger JSC community about some of the work we do with wildlife. It's a great opportunity that hopefully we can share some information that we have, answer a lot of questions, and hope people get a little bit more appreciation for the really impressive suite of wildlife we have here on site. So thank you, Noah, for setting this up. And I do encourage you guys to ask questions. I'll answer as many as I can, but the purpose of this really is to answer those burning questions and to speak to what y'all are interested in. So I put some slides together about things that are questions I get most commonly asked. But if y'all have other questions, please don't hesitate to ask. So let me pull up my presentation here, and we'll get started. Let's see. Just don't want to share that. Give a second here to connect with my PowerPoint presentation. Let's see if that works. Are you able to see the PowerPoint there, Noah?
Not yet, Matt. I think it's still loading.
Still loading, okay. We'll give that a second to load, and I'll just cover some of the topics that we'll go over on this first slide. I'm going to talk briefly about our deer population and how we count and manage that population. We'll talk about some of the efforts we have to measure and mitigate bird window collisions. We'll talk about our coyotes and some of their struggles with sarcoptic mange that we've been dealing with. We'll talk about human-wildlife conflict and how we deal with that on site. We'll talk about invasive plants and animals. We'll talk about and show you guys some of the wildlife photography we do and how we use photography to manage the wildlife and their habitats. And then we'll go into switch it back to you, Noah, to do some moderated question and answer. All right, so I think you guys should be able to see my my screen now. Can you? No?
Yes.
Thank you so much. All right, so first, the most common question I get by far is how many deer do we have on site? So I'll just answer that right off the bat. So if you tuned in for the presentation to hear that, you can sign off immediately. But we have 235 deer on site as of this month. We count the deer every fall to get a measure of the deer abundance, which is just abundance is just the term for the number of deer on site. And we count them in the fall for two reasons. The first reason that we count the deer in the fall is because most of the mortality in deer is going to start in their first year of life. So the deer here on site are born in May, June, and July. And if they make it to their first year of life, they're going to probably survive for much longer.
Hey,
The
Matt,
second
somebody's
reason,
got an open mic and you're getting a lot of feedback.
a lot of feedback.
Everybody,
Yeah, if you
please
guys could
mute your
just, if
mics.
you have your mics, just make sure you mute those real fast. All right. I unfortunately do not have a master mute on this program.
Like Judith Alton. Is there Judith Alton on here? Thank you.
All right, thank you all so much. But anyway, we measure the deer abundance in the fall for two reasons. We want to get past that period of high fawn mortality and to get an accurate, stable measurement of the deer population. And we also, the method we use for counting deer utilizes their antler morphology. So, people are like, how do you count the deer? All the deer look alike to me. And they do all look alike to me as well, but their antler morphology, the shape of their antlers is unique. It's like a fingerprint. No two antlered deer have the same shape of antlers. So the method we use to count the deer is what we call in the business a mark and recapture method. So we'll go out and we'll mark, and I'm using air quotes here if you can't see me, these deer by photographing their antlers, and those will be part of our cataloged or known population. So we might go out and photograph 20 deer, and we'll have specific information on the shape of their antlers. Then we'll go out sometime later, maybe a week later, and count and photograph all the remaining deer that we see. And for example, if half the deer we see in that second survey are already in our catalog, we know that our catalog is about 50% complete, and that our catalog represents about 50% of the antlered population. And we can do that step over and over and over again to get more and more accurate estimates of how many antlered deer there are. And there's a lot of equations and programs that use that type of thing that allows us to get really accurate error estimation around that. Of course, that only counts the antlered deer. So in addition, when we're going out and photographing antlered deer, we also count the ratio between the number of antlered deer we see versus the number of antlerless deer, and then we can multiply our estimate of antlered deer by that ratio of antlered to antlerless to get an estimate of that part of the population. So we do this every year. We use the same method every year. We drive the same routes every year. So we get comparable results through time. And what that looks like over the long term is this. So in this chart on the bottom, you can see the population or the abundance of deer is in orange, and the amount of rainfall at Hobby Airport is in dark blue. So like I said, we estimated about 235 deer this year in 2020. That's roughly the same number we saw as in 2019. And it's fairly close to our long-term and 5-year average for the population. So we don't see any significant long-term change in abundance, but we do see a lot of short-term year-to-year variation in how many deer we have on site. And we think most of that variation in abundance is due to changes in precipitation. So the quality of the browse, which is just our term for deer food, the quality of the browse is dependent on how much rainfall we get. So if we got a lot of rainfall, if it's a really wet year, you'll see really high quality browse. When that happens, more of the does will have twins, and more of those twins will survive that first year, and the population will go up. If it's a really dry year, if it's a drought year like 2011 or 2013, it's really dry, the quality of the plant life is going to be lower, and fawn survival and twinning will be lower as well. Of course, if you're eagled eye looking at this chart, you'll notice that 2017, it really underrepresents the real amount of rainfall we had on site. And that's because we exclude tropical storms. The precipitation itself isn't directly impacting the deer population. We're just using it as a metric to measure vegetation health or vegetation abundance. So we do exclude tropical storms because during tropical storms, obviously during Harvey, when we got 40 inches of rain, that's not adding to the health of the plants. It's all that water is just running off or creating a flood situation. So that's not being additive to the vegetation health. We do this every year, and we try to find what variables are impacting this. And if ever these variation becomes decoupled or we start to see other impacts, we know there might be a problem in the deer population that we need to address. Another topic I get a lot of questions about is bird window collisions. So you may be walking around a building on site or elsewhere, or even at home, and find dead birds laying next to a building. And unfortunately, that's a really common sight. Birds have a really hard time detecting very clear or very reflective glass as solid objects. So as they're flying, they may be unable to avoid those types of structures. Different researchers have estimated anywhere between 365 to 988 million birds die each year in collisions with buildings. At JSC, we think our baseline was about 100 birds per year dying to bird window collisions. Although when we get large flocks, like in this photo of indigo buntings, that annual count will be much higher. And we found that the newer energy efficient windows, although good for the environment from an energy conservation perspective, are particularly difficult for birds to see because they tend to be reflective in all the wavelengths. So birds see in a wider spectrum of wavelengths outside of the visual light that we see. So some glass that may be reflective to our eyes maybe appear more solid to them. But these newer energy efficient windows tend to be reflective in all the wavelengths that birds see. So we began tracking and trying to mitigate these bird window collisions back in 2013 when I first came on as the wildlife biologist here on site. And we learned what are the risk factors for collision, what causes these collisions, what days are they more likely to occur, what species are more likely to be impacted. We worked to modify some existing buildings to prevent collisions. We work to put guidelines in effect for when we build new buildings, that those new buildings won't be as problematic for birds. And in some areas where the windows are very, very clear, we're able to just close the blinds at certain times. And those blinds will create a solid object that the birds can perceive and avoid as they're flying. If you look at the photos here on the right, you can see the connector between building 4 South and 4 North. The type of glass that was on that connector was very, very reflective. It was almost a perfect mirror and caused hundreds of bird window collisions over the course of its life. So what we did is we put a perforated vinyl on top of that reflective glass. And what that perforated vinyl does is it allows birds to see the material as a solid object while not impacting our ability to see out of the glass from inside. If you've ever been on a subway or a taxi cab or a bus that has those kinds of covers on the windows, you may have seen this perforated vinyl material. So it's an outdoor rated material that's often used to cover glass surfaces, that's fairly durable and that birds can see. That's a modification of an existing building, but on the newer buildings, like on building 21, you may notice a bunch of tiny little dots, again, that don't really impact how we see in or out of the window, but they do make that window appear to be a solid object for birds so they can avoid it. So those little dots are called frit, and which is both a great Scrabble word and a great way to protect birds against bird window collisions. We do see periodic collisions, 1 or 2 a day throughout migration period. We know that most of the birds that are colliding windows are nocturnally migrating neotropical songbirds. So that's basically small songbirds that are migrating from Central and South America up, usually across the Gulf of Mexico and into the United States and into Canada for breeding. So because we know what species are colliding with the windows and we know they're doing it on migration, we can start to determine that it's really only a problem during certain months and it's really only a problem at night. So that's why we can get away with only closing the blinds at night and using our windows as normally during the day. We have noticed that these collisions are not evenly spaced out, that there are some days when we'll have lots and lots of birds collide with windows, not just on site, but in surrounding areas. And we've found that that's largely due to the wind patterns that we see. that if birds are undergoing normal migration, usually they are migrating at an altitude that is far beyond any building heights. So they're really only colliding with windows when they're stopping migration, when they're coming out of the sky to land, to rest, to refuel. And they do that in mass when you have a big wind shift. So if the birds are in the Yucatan Peninsula in South America and there's a strong south wind, they'll see that as a tailwind and they'll be more likely to get up in the air. So when we have periods of strong south winds, you'll tend to see a lot of birds in the air flying north. And if that wind shifts while they're migrating, all of those will drop out of the sky because all of a sudden they have a headwind, which they'll try to wait out. That phenomenon is called fallout, and because all the birds seemingly fall out of the sky. And when they do that, they come down to altitudes that they're low enough to collide with our windows. That's good news for us because these wind shifts can be forecasted through regular sort of meteorology forecasting. We can kind of determine when these bird window collisions might occur in mass. If there is a significant, south to north wind shift during these periods of migration, and we have a few of those maybe each year, but they're relatively uncommon. The other cause of bird window collisions is actually birds getting drunk. So in the early spring, sometimes you'll have berries like on wax myrtles or on holly or rubus or a bunch of other native and landscaping plants we have out here. The berries will remain on the tree or on the vine over the winter, and they'll begin to ferment and create alcohol. And alcohol has the same impact on birds as it does on people. It makes them really bad at flying, and they'll run into windows, and we'll see sometimes entire flocks of birds get drunk and repeatedly slam into windows. And that can lead to a lot of injuries and even some of these birds killing themselves. So those are sort of these two major causes of these mass bird collisions, are these wind shifts during migration and these fermenting wild berries. Another topic that we've been addressing, especially this year, is the coyotes wanting to maybe feel included in our own pandemic have had a disease outbreak of their own. Starting in the winter of 2019 and on into the January and February of this year, we start to notice that some of our coyotes have developed sarcoptic mange, which is a mite that impacts domestic dogs as well as coyotes. And that mite can cause itching and inflammation. It can cause hair loss, and it can cause them to change their behavior due to just being uncomfortable. The mite itself can lead to secondary infections that are fatal, but it can also lead to hair loss that can result in hypothermia. And if you have these animals that don't have any hair, tend to have extremely high winter mortality because they simply can't keep warm. We started observing this back in the winter of 2019, 2020. And, as an isolated incident isn't too big of a deal. But as spring and summer came around, we found that nearly all of our coyotes were becoming infected with this mange. And that by the summer of this year, we didn't have any healthy coyotes on site. That was concerning for two reasons. One, because coyotes are valuable, as a member of our native population, but they're also a key predator population in controlling prey species, our rabbits, our cotton rats, our fawns. They're major predators for those species. So our concern was that if our coyote population crashed out with high winter mortality, that we'd see spikes in deer and rats and other animals that we don't necessarily want to see really high numbers of. So we worked with the veterinarians on site who were really gracious and willing to take a chance in working with some odd questions. And we started to give medicated bait to the coyotes with a caricide, which will help them bite off that parasite. So it's an oral medication that we can mix with a hot dog or cat food or something. They can eat that medication, and that will protect them from both the adult mites as well as maintain that protection till the eggs and hatch out, and it hopefully rid them of that disease. This project is ongoing. We've treated some animals and we've seen them start to recover. We've also seen animals from neighboring territories move on to site and not get mange, which is also a victory that they're not passing it on. So it'll be, winter will truly be the test to see how successful we are, and hopefully we will see some positive results in the spring. Other issues that we deal with a lot are what fall under the classification of human-wildlife conflict. So human-wildlife conflict, again, is an industry term or technical term for any negative interaction between people and wildlife. So that's animals in buildings, that's collisions with vehicles or buildings or lights or windmills or whatever. Injuries caused either to the animal or to the people, as well as property damage. Here's some examples from on site. We have a deer that gets stuck on the fence. We have a red-cockaded woodpecker here. I'm sorry, that's not a red. That's a pileated woodpecker. A pileated woodpecker destroying the light poles at the Gilruth. One of our venomous species of water moccasin or cottonmouth. And then the bottom right, that's a barn owl that we pulled out of building 49. We do respond to human-wildlife conflict calls. Since 2012, we're just shy of 1,000 calls. And so we will go out, and if we need to catch an animal and remove it, or if we need to turn it over to a wildlife rehabilitator, we can do that. If we need to repair a building or modify a fence or modify any kind of structure that's been damaged, that's something that we all do as part of our contract. So we maintain a lot of specialized tools to do that. We have specialized live traps. We have mist nets. We have all types of animal handling equipment, from things that to deal with stinging insects to deal with rabies vectors. We have things to modify fences, to scope burrows for a burrowing species like armadillos and skunks. We have bat detectors that pick up their ultrasonic echolocation signals. And we have just a ton of PPE that helps us deal really safely with these animals. So maybe the safety moment for this talk is that we have a lot of wildlife on site. Some of them carry diseases. Some of them are venomous. All of them, may try to bite you. So if you do run into a wildlife issue on site, give us a call, get in contact with us, and don't try to handle it yourself. Let us come out there and use the right tools to make sure that we're doing it in a safe way and a way to, protect their well-being as well as your own. Next topic I want to cover very briefly is invasive plants, but it's one of the most important things that we look at. When you talk about wildlife, you can't talk about wildlife unless you're talking about plants. So the Johnson Space Center is dominated by, from an ecosystem perspective, by a native plant community called the Texas Coastal Prairie. So coastal prairie would have historically spread all the way from Kingsville, Texas, along the coast of the United States to Lafayette, Louisiana, throughout coastal Texas and Louisiana, covering thousands of acres. Most of that prairie is now gone because of agriculture, grazing, invasive species, urban development, a bunch of other pressures on the ecosystem that cause it to disappear. But this type of prairie is exceptionally diverse. It maintains a whole host of plants that, per square meter, you see more diversity of plants in coastal prairie than I'd argue, any other ecosystem in the United States. It also supports some really cool species like Atwater's prairie chicken would have historically occurred on this type of ecosystem. It's of course now endangered and really persists mostly in captivity. So that ecosystems persist a lot on site. However, more and more acreage each year is being consumed, not so much by our human activity. Actually, our human activity each year is actually holding less and less acreage. But instead, we're seeing non-native plants competing with our native plant communities. So species like Chinese tallow, Johnson grass, torpedo grass, McCartney rose, salt cedar, basie grass, king ranch blue stem, and a bunch of others are competing with our native grass species and our native forbs to overtake that acreage. And every acre that's lost in that plant community is really less valuable for our wildlife community as well. So we do some things like, the groundskeeping does a great job mowing our prairies to keep the woody vegetation like Chinese tallow down. They use herbicides in targeted places to remove emergent invasive species. And then we use things like this satellite image you see on the right to monitor invasive species. So here our native species are represented in the green, non-native species are represented in blue, and our built environment and parking lots and bare ground is represented in red and white. So you'll notice that there's still a large amount of native prairie left, but there's a significant amount of invasive plants, nearly everywhere where construction or dirt moving or anything has happened. You can see the marks of that human activity and the persistence of invasive plants in those areas. But invasive plants aren't the only invasive species we have. We also have invasive animals on site. We have stray and feral cats that often come into the site. We used to have sort of breeding populations of cats on site. We trapped almost all those out in 2012 through 2014. Now we just occasionally see feral cats actually coming in on people's cars. So feral cats or stray cats will get into people's engine bays. People go to work in the morning like they normally do, and the cat that will ride along through the gate with them. We mostly see a lot of kittens, but also adult cats as well. So we try to trap those out and get those turned over to a cat group or the city before they start breeding on site. Non-native insects like crazy ants are also a problem. You can see this photo in the top right of crazy ants attacking an electrical system. The brown sort of fuzziness is actually thousands and thousands of tiny ants all joined together, shorting out this, I think it's a fuse in this electrical panel that runs part of our sewage system. So these ants, for whatever reason, are attracted to electrical systems, and because their bodies have some amount of conductivity, they can short out these systems and damage electrical systems. So we had a massive effort in 2017 to eliminate that species, which we have done, and we haven't seen any since. But we still have longhorn crazy ants, which is the species in the bottom right there, that still occasionally occur every so often. Another non-native species we have that y'all are probably familiar with if you worked in the mall area are our Muscovy ducks. We had Muscovy ducks for years, and we've had problems with them every decade or so. And then the decision was made to make the ponds recirculate, and when they began to recirculate, we started to have high nutrient levels in those ponds. So we worked to reduce the number of Muscovy ducks by addling their eggs. We started in 2013. So instead of removing or euthanizing any ducks, we just allowed them to live out their lives, and instead just simply prevented them from reproducing. So when they laid eggs, we would coat those eggs in a food grade oil, like a vegetable oil, and that would prevent those eggs from normally developing. They would never hatch. So the birds would sit on those nests for a full term, believing that their eggs were still going to hatch, and they simply never would develop into chicks. And this was a way for them basically to waste their nesting season. And we did that over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, and now to the point where they ran out of eggs. So we still have Muscovy ducks on site, but none of them have any eggs left to lay. And once the Muscovy ducks have sort of removed their claim to the site, we've started to see native ducks on site. So we still have ducks nesting in the mall area. We have whistling ducks that nest and produce young, and we also have mallard and whistling ducks are the two species that we see most commonly nesting in the mall area. One of the tools that I like to talk about that we use a lot, which is really good for presentations because you can actually show people, is to use a lot of photography. It's something that my approach to doing wildlife management, especially as the only biologist on site, I often have to sort of multiply my own effort And one of the ways to do that is to use photography, because it's a really quick way to get a lot of information with a surprisingly small amount of time. So we use historic imagery to show how past management actions have impacted the ecosystem, and to also answer questions about how the landscape became the way it is today. That helps us inform of, hey, people did this in the past and this is how it turned out. As we make decisions about how we manage our habitat in the future, we can look at those past actions and see the results of those. We use motion-activated infrared cameras all the time. Those help monitor for secret nocturnal animals. That's things like bobcats, coyotes, wild hogs. We monitor regularly for wild hogs. We haven't seen any yet, but if we did, we'd most likely pick those up on the infrared game cameras. I worked with two photographers, Nora Moran and Lauren Harnett, who are two NASA photographers who are both extremely talented individuals, and Lauren decided that she wanted to photograph a bobcat on site. So she helped me build this high definition camera trap, which we basically took her SLR camera, put it in a waterproof box, hooked it up to an infrared sensor, rigged up a bunch of circuitry and some code and some flashes, and was able to go out, put this in the woods, leave it for a few days, and photograph a lot of the species that people don't regularly see. And I'll show you some of those photographs that Nora and Lauren took. We also use digital microscopes for insects, mites. We use a lot of aerial and satellite photography. They really help multiply our efforts. We can quickly assess a ecosystem by using computer tools, as opposed to going around and walking each acre. We can just look at it from above and have the computer analyze those acres. Good example of that is what I showed you before in the invasive plant slide. We use ultraviolet photography. This was used to show the difference between the new energy efficient windows. These are windows on building 12, and you can see how reflective they are in the ultraviolet, which some birds can see in, versus the windows immediately adjacent to building 12. I think this is building 30. The older style windows, you can actually, in the ultraviolet, see the blinds behind the window, even though they appear a little bit reflective to our eyes. And of course, we use digital photography for deer and bird counts, as I talked about earlier. So here's some of the photographs that Nora and Lauren took of some of the animals that we do have on site that you don't often see because you're not out here in the middle of the night and they're particularly wary of you. We have river otters that will occasionally use our forested wetlands, hunting for things like crawfish and frogs and little things that hang out in our woodlands, which tend to be flooded for most of the year. We have coyotes on site, which we already talked about. This is a healthy coyote with its full set of fur. We have possums, which you may have seen. We have bobcats. This is a photo from this spring over in the 200 area. Some of the bobcats walking around there. And here's a photo of some anhingas, which are a diving bird that nest in the old HL&P canal behind Building 26. So these are anhinga chicks, which are very cool species. And here's some examples of the other types of photography we use. We did some experimentation with drone photography. So this top left photo is a photograph from a drone. Some historic photography. So this is a USDA photo of JSC before JSC was built. So this is from 1953. So you can see that the entire JSC property was all prairie before the construction. Some photos of some insects we found with some spaceflight hardware, some insects that we found in buildings, and some of our coyotes hunting here in our infrared photography. So these are all great ways to get views into the past, or views at night, or views into things that are really small that we would otherwise be really difficult to see and really difficult to share with y'all. So I'm really happy to work with these photographers who do this kind of stuff, because it's easy to tell people about river otters and coyotes and bobcats, but they're really hard to see. But that doesn't make them any less important and any less worthy of our appreciation on site. So I'm more than halfway through our time here, but I wanted to see if y'all had any questions so far, and I'll try to take those as much as I can.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Matt. That was definitely really awesome. Just a reminder for everyone who's joined during Matt's presentation to please mute your microphone so that everyone's able to hear Matt. We did have some really awesome questions come in through the chat. So Matt, the first one is, have the animal populations increased with less people coming on site? And do the deer miss the human interaction?
We haven't seen any increases in the deer in populations as a whole. You saw from the deer count that it stayed about where we would expect it to be for this level of rainfall and this type of sort of ecosystem state. Of course, the deer population was already sort of baked in before any kind of pandemic, right? All the breeding was done in November and December of last year. So the whatever twins were going to be born were sort of already set up for that. So we haven't seen any notice in population change. We have seen that the animals have moved and occupied different areas than they wouldn't typically. So we see a lot more deer nearby the buildings and around the buildings than we did previously. So they're just becoming much more comfortable getting closer into where people usually are. I wouldn't say they miss people. I think people were probably generally a nuisance to the deer, just being in their space. But we haven't seen any big indications that the wildlife population has sort of rebounded or changed in any way.
Awesome. And Matt, I don't know if your camera's on. You're welcome to turn it on if it's not.
Oh, I think it is.
Okay, it may be on my end. Next one is, where and how do neighboring larger animals get onto site? Is there a special animal entrance somewhere?
No, but our fence, so the question is fair. Our fence is actually fairly permeable to predators like bobcats and coyotes. They can both go under it, and coyotes can easily clear an 8-foot fence. That's not a problem at all for them. So, and we regularly observe the deer coming and going from the gates, especially through places like gate 1 and 2. So, we do want to have a lot of interchange of animals between our property and the neighboring properties. If you're familiar with the area, we're bordered on the north and on the northwest by 2 fairly undeveloped properties: Armand Bayou Nature Center, which is of course a preserve which has a very healthy habitat, and the University of Houston Clear Lake, which has a lot of habitat as well. So we want to make sure that we're exchanging animals between those 2 places for a couple reasons. One is to maintain our genetics. We certainly don't want to get an inbred population. If you start to get animals in captivity or they can't leave or go, the population numbers get too small and there's not enough genetic diversity. So we want to make sure that they're exchanging genes. And then also for animals that have really large territories like coyotes, they may need more than just JSC to support themselves. So they may need to have territory in the neighborhoods in an Armand Bayou or UH Clear Lake as well. So our fence is plenty permeable for the types of animals that we're looking for. And that's good for our native animals, but of course that's bad when we're talking about things like feral hogs and stuff. We know we have feral hogs in the county, so the fence doesn't offer much protection from species like that.
Okay, and the next one is, how long have some of these animal populations been on site? Are there several generations, especially with the deer?
Yeah, the animals have been on site for all of history. The fence was sort of built around them. They didn't move to the Space Center. The Space Center really moved to them. I did, over the last few years, I've done a fairly deep dive into the history of the Space Center, going all the way back to 1829 and trying to find everything that happened on the Space Center from the first Anglo settlement all the way to when it was purchased by NASA. And I've developed through some historic research a pretty clear picture of all the different activities, agricultural and recreation and ownership uh, for the last 200 years. And they all indicate that there was always a lot of wildlife on site, and it was just in the past sort of half century that the rest of the area has sort of urbanized around it and left these sort of islands of habitat.
Oh, okay, awesome. Next one. This is from a big fan. Kelly Scott has interacted with you prior to this.
Okay.
And you mentioned at the time that an animal you expected to see at some point but had not yet was the ringtail.
I'm still waiting for it. I'm still waiting for it. So ringtail cats, for y'all that don't know, are a species of animal that they kind of look like a cross between a ferret and a raccoon and a cat. But they're really cool species. They're secretive. They occur in Texas, in the valley, as well as in central Texas. They're very hard to see. They tend to be associated with riparian areas, but they also tend to travel. So they tend to get on rail cars and ride all over the country. So it's very difficult to even know what their range is because they're hard to see. And then they get to weird places traveling on human conveyances. I know there was a story of there was one scene in Houston some years ago, but it was found that it actually traveled here in the belly of somebody's RV. It wasn't naturally occurring here. So I haven't seen one on site, but I'm always have my eyes open for ringtail cats and spotted skunks. Those would be two species which I haven't seen on site yet, but I would love to see both of those on site. Those are both species that could theoretically occur in this type of ecosystem. We're within their range, but we haven't seen them yet.
Well, if any of our participants in the chat ever see one of those, please alert
take a picture
immediately.
Take a picture. Let me know. Be excited.
On site, do we have any species of fox or ocelots?
No, we don't have any fox, and we're a little far north for ocelots, but we do have bobcats. And the bobcats do breed on site. So we'll see occasionally bobcat kittens every now and again on our infrared game cameras, which is really the best way to see them. We don't often. I've actually never, like in real life, seen a bobcat inside. I always see them on the cameras.
Oh, okay. And then on kind of a related note, what happened to the alligator that used to visit the pond?
It depends what pond you're talking about, but we have a lot of alligators on site. We do keep track of our alligators, and generally the way we do that is we don't necessarily count the number of alligators we have on site so much as we count occupancy. So we look at all of the bodies of water that we have, and we see whether they're occupied or not, whether there's an alligator in there or there isn't. So through most of the time, we're at 75 to 100% occupancy. Nearly every water body, every natural water body, has an alligator in it. And we do it by occupancy because a large water body like the canal might be fully occupied with 3 small alligators, or maybe fully occupied with sort of 1 large alligator. For example, the pond by building 44 and building 20, that has an alligator in it right now. And the Este area has an alligator as well. We don't allow alligators in the mall ponds, both because it's just not great habitat for them, and also because it's just too difficult to keep people from feeding the alligators in the mall ponds. Feeding alligators is always a bad idea. Feeding any animal, any wild animals, is always a bad idea, save for maybe birds. But it seems like every time we get an alligator in the mall pond, people feed it, and it becomes quickly a problem. So if we do have an alligator in the mall pond, usually we just we'll remove it to another unoccupied water body. We did have one back, I believe, in 2013, 2014 that it was fed. It had been fed so much that we had to remove it from the population. So Parks and Wildlife came and removed that animal.
Wow. That's crazy. And we are getting just a lot of feedback in the chat.
Okay.
We're seeing a ringtail sighting, not on site, but not too far off it. And there is some heated debate about whether a deer can raise 3 fawns. Can you shed any light on this, Matt?
No, I refuse. Yeah, no, that's yeah. So can a deer have? So certainly a deer can have a single fawn. Two is very common. The sort of rule in biology is the 2N rule. So you take the number of nipples and divide by 2, and that's the sort of basic number of young the animal should have. So, deer should have 2. Twinning is very common. That being said, you can have triplets. You can't even have quadruplets. So quadruplets is certainly possible, and there are reports in captive white-tailed deer as well as a few in the wild of quadruplets. Although twins is by far the most common. Most of the time that I see multiple fawns following around one doe, it's just because it's a doe that is letting them nurse. They may not be actually related. So a lot of times fawns will just latch onto a doe who is willing to let them nurse. So doesn't necessarily imply that they're dam and fawn.
Okay, and we have a scared employee wondering about tarantulas on site.
No tarantulas. Too far east for tarantulas. We do have people release their pets every now and again on site, which I cannot emphasize how bad of an idea that is. But we do have venomous spiders. We have 2 species of widow spider, black widow, or I'm sorry, we have black widows, and we have 2 species of recluses, which are all well, all spiders are venomous. Nearly all spiders are venomous, but those species are particularly harmful to people. But they're all very small spiders. We don't have any tarantulas, so worry not.
What is the rarest animal or bird that you have ever seen documented a visit from? Sorry, what is the rarest animal or bird you've ever seen?
On site?
On site.
Oh yeah. So I used to work in my personal history. I used to work on rare and endangered species, so I've seen some pretty rare ones. Probably on site. I'm going to give you a boring answer, but we saw Sprague's pipits, which are a species of bird that is endangered in part of its range. So if you want to look up the Sprague pipit, they're kind of small brown birds. Exciting, maybe only to me, but that they qualify as endangered. Of course, Atwater's prairie chickens, which are in captivity on site, are an extremely rare bird, an extremely credible bird. If you ever get a chance to see an Atwater prairie chicken, highly recommend it. But they're captive on site. We do see river otters, which aren't sort of globally uncommon, but they are uncommon on site. Similarly, bobcats and coyotes are difficult to see, but again, relatively common. I've seen a box turtle on site, which I've only seen one time, a 3-toed box turtle. But we do have box turtles on sites. We just, again, don't see them very often.
Okay, awesome. And sorry, I'm trying to fit as many of these in as we can. So sorry if I missed any questions in the chat. Matt, can employees volunteer to help get rid of invasive plants or help in some other way with your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't have a method on site for doing that type of volunteering, but there are plenty of local organizations that if you want to get involved with doing that type of work, removing invasive plants or something like that, groups like the Master Naturalist Group, which is a Parks and Wildlife group, or the folks over at Arm and Bayou, which our neighboring nature center, they're always looking for volunteers, and they'd be happy to let you loose removing invasive plants and things like that. So if you have the ability and the willpower to get out there and want to make a difference in our local community as far as protecting native habitat, I can't encourage you enough to do that. It's such a great idea.
And we will do a follow-up roundup story on this and throw that information from Matt in there if you're interested in getting involved.
Yeah.
Matt, have you noticed any strange behaviors of deer or bucks towards bicycle riders?
I haven't. So a lot of the behavior that we looked at, and I did a study on this, which was a very weird study several years ago, which I basically walked around site and saw how close I could get to deer, and then measured that, which it's science. And what I found was that you can get actually really close to deer when you're in an area where they expect you to be. So if you're on a sidewalk or in a roadway, they're very comfortable with you being there, and you can actually get really close to them. But if you go into an area where they don't expect you to be out into the prairies or out into the woods or something, it's actually very difficult to get close to these animals. In much the same way that you might not be intimidated if you saw a deer in the woods, but you might be kind of freaked out if you saw one in the hallway of your house, right? Like it's sort of the same kind of situation. So a lot of the times we see a scenario where this deer didn't move out of the way. So okay, well maybe he expected you to sort of be in that environment. Another thing they may be referencing with that question is occasionally deer have a really hard time telling people on bicycles and people in vehicles. I know when I worked on elk, you could get on a horse and they would just completely ignore you. They felt like you were part of the horse, and I don't know, it was very weird. They have a hard time, as animals, differentiating what you're riding with who you are. But we haven't had any. Thankfully, haven't had any negative interactions between bike riders and deer that have at least come to my attention so far.
Okay. Do we have any apple shell snails?
I not that I know of. I do know that they do have invasive snails in the Armand Bayou watershed, and I don't know if we don't have that kind of like riparian habitat that is really good for those types of snails. So I haven't seen them on site. If you were looking for them, the place I'd look for is in the HLMP canal. But again, it's a very artificial waterway, so it might not have that type of habitat. But yeah, invasive snails are a problem locally, but we haven't really seen them or been too big of a deal just because of our types of habitat.
Okay, and we have 5 minutes, Matt, so I have three
All
final
right.
questions.
Lightning round.
First off, can you share a little bit about your background and how you ended up at JSC?
That's that's not a 5-minute question, but yeah, I've always been interested in doing environmental work. I went into college with the idea of doing some type of conservation work. I went to school in California, and while I was in California, the hot place where a lot of jobs were actually was in forestry. In California in 2006, the housing market was red hot, and they couldn't get enough wood out of the forest to build all these houses that people wanted in 2006 and 2007. I don't want to spoil the ending for you, but 2008 rolled around, and when I graduated, the economy collapsed, and there were no forestry jobs. The price of wood dropped. People weren't doing timber work anymore, and in that part of the country, it really was forestry that funded a lot of the wildlife work and things that were going on. So instead of going into that, I started working on whooping cranes, and I migrated with whooping cranes for a couple of years, flying between Florida and Wisconsin. I also worked on sea turtles for the Air Force, and eventually went into grad school. When I came out of grad school, I was looking at working on military bases. Again, wildlife work is always difficult to fund, and for a lot of reasons, the military always has money. So, and they have large swaths of land, and the DoD actually usually does a really good job of managing their wildlife. So, I was looking for jobs that were on military bases, and although JSC isn't a military base, it sort of was similar enough that I was able to apply for that. So I applied in 2012. I was brought on a 6-month contract to write a wildlife management plan and carry out that plan. We completed that wildlife management in 2012. We upgraded that wildlife management plan again in 2017, and we've been working off that plan and using that as a guide for how we manage wildlife on site ever since.
Awesome. And then is there a website for your work where folks can go learn more and browse available photos?
Yeah. I have a website on the internal site there, and I'll send you guys a link for it as we go through on there. But it's PAE maintains a SharePoint site, and I'll include a link for there as well.
Okay, and the final question, if employees see an animal lost or in distress on site, what is the best number to call or action to take?
Sure. It's to contact the work control, which is 32038, and let the work control operator know where you are. Most importantly, just to describe where it is, and we'll try to get somebody out there to handle it. So that's the facilities work control. So the same number you might call for an air conditioner issue or a plumbing issue or whatever. We try to wrap it all up in that one phone number. But if you call work control, will come out and deal with that. Now, if you have something that if you've been injured or you have a vehicle collision or something like that, you can dial the 5 3s and get a medical or emergency response from that.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for joining. We're going to look to do some more JSC wildlife related things moving forward in 2021. So stay tuned to Roundup, and thank you, Matt, for your time.
Thanks so much, Noah. Thank you for setting this up, and thanks everybody for your great questions.
All right, bye now. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much. It was great.